Welcome to the Exploress. Time traveling through history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. Next episode, we'll be diving back into the 1920s. There is a lot more to explore. Now, though, I've got something special for you. Author Elodie Harper is back, this time to discuss the thrilling conclusion of her epic trilogy about some of the women of ancient Rome. So, grab your scrappy sandals and sink into your favorite reading chair. Let's go traveling. But first, a shout out to some of my patrons. My newest pirate queens, Anna and Kiana. My new lady presidents, Kyle and Notker. My warrior queens, Sarah, two lovely Alexises, Amanda, Kate, Ika, June, Neve and Sloan, and Samantha. My imperial empresses, Bridget, Faye and Whimsy Soapworks, Katie, Samara, and Teresa. And my lady pharaohs, Sophie, Laura, Kate, Kot, Cheryl, and the fabulous Courtneys. This show just would not be possible without the generous support of all my patrons. For just a few dollars a month, they get episodes early and completely ad-free, exclusive bonus episodes, discounts on merchandise, full interviews with guests, and more. To find out all about it, go to my website, theexploresspodcast.com. Hi, Elodie. Welcome back to the Exploress.
Hey, Kate. It's so nice to be back.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you here. I cannot wait to talk about the Temple of Fortuna, the third book in this incredible series, which I just devoured. I was just saying before we started recording that I just absolutely, I'm a huge fangirl of yours. I love this series. And I had really high expectations of this last book, and you just completely knocked it out of the park. I stayed up way too late reading it. I was on the edge of my seat. It's such a beautiful book. And I have been recommending this series to everyone I know.
Thank
so
you.
I am excited to talk to you about it.
Me too. It's really, I so enjoyed our last podcast. It's lovely to talk to you.
Let's just start by pitching the series. So for anyone who hasn't read it yet, let's talk a little bit about the series. And I will start by saying, listeners, that Ellie and I will be talking a little bit about books 1 and 2 in this series. So there might be some spoilers. If you have not read the first 2 books, go back and listen to my episode, our interview from 2021. Listen to that. Read The Wolf Den. Read The House with the Golden Door, and then come back to us, and we will be waiting for you. Just putting that out there now, because there's stuff from the first 2 books I really want to talk to Elodie about. Okay, so let's just roughly recap this series leading up to this third book. Tell us a little bit about what is the series about and what's happened so far?
So the title, The Wolf Den, is actually from the Latin word lupana, which means both wolf den and brothel. And the first book is set in the actual lupana of Pompeii, which is a building that survives, in extraordinary detail, actually. So the first book follows the fortunes of the main character, Amara, and the women that she works with in the brothel. And it's a story really about her quest for freedom, how to get out of the brothel, what routes are open to her, what she has to do to survive, how ruthless she has to be. My motive for writing the book was really about thinking about the texts, the archaeological sources, the evidence that we have of what the women's lives were like, because I feel like this particular group of women in Roman society, they were, enslaved brothel workers. They were very stigmatized in their own time. They continue to be quite objectified in ours. And I wanted to focus on their lives rather than just the fact that, they had to do sex work. So it's very much, the first book is very much a novel about Pompeii, about Amara's quest for survival and her relationships with the women. By the time we get to the House with the Golden Door, she's found her route up to the next rung on the ladder, in that she found a wealthy patron. And so that book is less about how she survives and more about what she does to choose to live. So she has more space to think about relationships, what she wants from life, which, and in that book I was able to explore through Ovid's depiction of courtesans, Terence's depiction of courtesans, the actual frescoes in Pompeii, what they tell us about the life of a courtesan, which could be very glamorous, but also very precarious. So that's where she is in that book. And then, yes, by the time we get to the Temple of Fortuna, she's changed patron again. She's in a very powerful position in Rome, but she also has her family now back in Pompeii. So that's where the Temple of Fortuna starts. So really, the series, it follows a main character, a woman, on kind of her quest to try and have agency in her life. But it's also very much touching on multiple characters' lives, how they deal with, enslavement, male-female relationships, power dynamics, or, a lot of the stuff that people in the ancient world were faced with that I really wanted to explore.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about a few of those characters shortly, because I do think there's some other key characters that Amara spends time with in the brothel that are it's really interesting to see the route that their story took. So there's her pimp from the brothel,
Yeah,
Felix,
I
who
can't believe
is just
I
a
missed
very
him
bad
out.
man. But
Because like the entire narrative arc actually is this intense
oh
love-hate
gosh, yeah.
rivalry, revenge drama going on between Amara and Felix, the man who owns her in the first book. Yeah.
Yes, he's such an interesting. I mean, you just loathe him. He's very easy to loathe, but he's also a complex character with
Yeah.
he had a difficult childhood himself, and yeah, really interesting character, Felix. And then you have Rufus in book 2, who's her patron, who also, I mean, look, a lot of the men I would say in this series we could call problematic, perhaps,
Yes.
complicated. Um, and then you have, I mean, I loved in book 2, you have Amara has a romantic relationship with someone who she really is very off limits to her. It's like a very taboo relationship, but it's really beautiful to see her and Philos fall in love and have to navigate. He's still
Yeah.
enslaved. She is not, but she's still in a very precarious situation. She has a patron, but if she loses his favor, she could lose everything that she's gained. So I just, book 2 is this incredible study in this woman who has found her freedom, but there's just still so much to lose.
She's actually my personal favorite of the series.
I really loved that book a lot. I think you do such a good job of navigating the fact that this woman, I mean, she lost an incredibly, like, her best friend in the brothel at the end of book 1. She loses in a pretty dramatic and horrible way. And she's still grappling with that in book 2 and thinking about, what does it mean that she's free? How does she stay free? How does she maintain her agency? Because she's in a relationship where she, in many ways, she's playing a role. She's playing the role of a courtesan for
Yeah.
this man who expects certain things from her. And if she loses his favor, she could lose everything. So I just think book 2 is so fraught in really, really interesting ways. So, okay, we get to the end of book 2. She has a new patron who, definite improvement over the last patron, but still not the man she loves, so not ideal.
Yeah.
So I was really interested to see with book 3, we get out of Pompeii and the book starts in Rome. So she is really at the heart of it all, really at the heart of the empire. And I thought it was really interesting that you start the book with Amara going to visit the emperor's consort, a woman named Berenice, who is a real historical figure and has been serving essentially as informal empress. I'm interested to hear a little bit about why you chose to talk about Berenice and introduce us to this character, this real woman who was a foreigner. She was not Roman, really. Why did you choose to introduce us to this character, especially a woman who was on the eve of her exile?
So I mean, Berenice is a fascinating historical figure in her own right. She gets the tiniest cameo really in this book. There are certain parallels between Berenice and Amara in that both are, highly intelligent women. I mean, Berenice was an extraordinarily intelligent woman, but a bit like Cleopatra, who she was sometimes compared to due to kind of the Roman xenophobia, like a foreign temptress type character. Cleopatra also was this phenomenally intelligent ruler in her own right, as was Berenice. But Berenice became the consort of Titus during the wars, and the fall of Jerusalem. And she adapts to essentially, she collaborates with the Romans in every sense. And they do seem to have had a very loving relationship. Titus does seem to have loved Berenice a great deal and have thought very highly of her. And yet she was not considered a suitable consort for a Roman emperor. And so he banished her, even though she was, by all accounts, the love of his life. And I think, she sort of brings up, therefore, questions about how even an emperor can't choose who their partner is. In terms of, if Titus can't choose to be with the person he loves, who can? But also for Berenice herself, even when you're at your most powerful, I mean, the Temple of Fortuna, I mean, the whole book is kind of saturated with ideas and images of the Wheel of Fortune and just the idea of the goddess Fortuna and the role that chance plays in life. This idea that Berenice was right at the top and then, everything changes. So there was that. There was also the fact that she simply would have been in Rome at this key point when Amara is in Rome. And, women would network with other women. And so it made sense to me, just from a purely practical point of view, that if Amara was networking at sort of the highest levels of Vespasian, the previous emperor who's recently died, so, it would make sense that she would be embroiled in the Vespasian Titus camp as opposed to the Domitian camp, given the loyalty of her patron to Vespasian. So there were many reasons why Berenice was there. But I mean, essentially, I wanted, and also the Wolf Den trilogy has been very female dominated. And so I wanted to start with powerful women. So that's why it's the opening scene. That we don't start with Amara and Demetrius. Originally, I started the book with Amara and Demetrius in the first draft. And then I just thought, no, that's not how I want to start it. That's not kind of Amara's world. So that's what happened.
And that makes complete sense to me, because Amara has really reached the pinnacle of what it means to be a courtesan. Her patron Demetrius is very rich. He's very influential. He treats her, quite well. They might not be in love, but they have a pretty good working relationship. She has more money and more freedom than she's ever had, but at the same time, she's still a courtesan and a kept woman. And as you said, her family is back in Pompeii. So she's feeling very torn between her loyalty to this man who's given her a lot. And also, I think in showing us the political situation from Amara's point of view, we see how precarious and political her situation is too. I think it really mirrors Amara's situation really in interesting ways. I mean, I don't want to give away. Something really interesting happens while she's in Rome that I don't want to give away, but it really helps to underscore how even a courtesan at the very highest levels can be a target and can be in danger. Like that her safety is never assured.
Yes, I think for sure.
It's great. I will not spoil it, but I want to talk a little bit about the courtesan system, because I feel like through the course of this series, you've shown us the entire kind of run the gamut, the entire ladder of what it meant in ancient Rome to be a courtesan. Amara starts out kind of the lowest of the low. She's enslaved, and she's in a brothel, and she has very, very little agency. And then she ends up being freed, but she's still someone's girlfriend, full-time girlfriend.
Yeah,
And then she kind of
it's almost
continues
like
to
a
move
type
up
of
that
concubine
ladder.
in the second book rather than courtesan, because courtesan implies probably a greater degree of agency. I mean, some women were freed in ancient Rome specifically to be sort of sexual partners. So it gave them greater status than being simply a slave that was sexually exploited. So they have some kind of status, some implication of love, affection, and mutual care. But equally, it's not the status of a wife. It's a kind of companion, concubine, and it's something that you owe to someone. You legally owe them that service if you've been freed for that reason. So, because all freed people had legal duties that they owed to the people who freed them. They would be often financially obliged to make a contribution. They would sometimes be obliged to work for free. they would owe their loyalty, their lives, their time in all sorts of complex ways that a freeborn person wouldn't.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really interesting and moving part of the series you see women who, some of them are technically free, but it comes at a cost and it comes with strings, and there's so much fraught territory that Amara has to navigate in being kind of a kept woman in Rome, even to be um, the concubine of this man who is very powerful and very rich and seems to treat her well. So could you tell me a little bit about what does it mean to kind of be at the top of the ladder as a concubine or as a courtesan? Like, how did you think about in crafting Amara's story? I mean, this is kind of as high as she's going to go in this particular position. How did you think about opening up her mindset to the reader and her worldview?
So I think this sort of space that the courtesan inhabited is quite an interesting one, in that in some respects they were freed from the constraints that more respectable women might be obliged to live by. They could have multiple lovers. The ones right at the top might have a degree of financial independence. They could be involved in politics. I mean, in some senses, I guess similarities to elite aristocratic women in the degree of which they were mixing with powerful men potentially involved in political intrigue. And yet they did not have the power or the status of elite aristocratic women. I mean, nothing like it. They were still kind of very sexualized, disposable. They could never, it's just not possible for them to attain that level of respect. And, also, Amara's patron, Demetrius, is an imperial freedman. And this is a similar kind of status in a way, in that imperial freedmen were phenomenally powerful politically, but socially they were not regarded as being, it's the Roman class system, really. It's hard even to convey the stigma that surrounded being freed, because we see, freed people engaged in all sorts of sort of high politics and commerce and money and wealth and all the rest of it. But it carried this lifelong stigma of having been enslaved. And that's why when Amara is talking to another courtesan who's kind of mocking her about Demetrius's past and the implication that he too was obliged to give sexual favors when he was young. And there's always that implication with someone who used to be enslaved, because sexual exploitation was so endemic, this assumption that you would have served your master or mistress in all possible senses. So I do think, not just courtesans, I think this whole concept of how the Romans viewed enslaved people and freed people is so alien for us. Although it has some kind of echoes of the class system, it's really not the same. It's not the same sort of snobbery. It's based on other ideas, and on ideas of bodily integrity and all sorts of things. Because like a Roman citizen couldn't be subjected to capital punishment, in the same way that a freed or an enslaved person could. This idea that you had been a person who didn't have agency over their own body was not seen as something for which you deserve compassion, but something that was shameful.
Yeah, I think it is such an interesting issue, especially in ancient Rome, the idea of a freedman. Demetrius has such an incredible amount of money and power, and yet there is this stigma around the fact that he was once enslaved, and you can't ever shake that. And Amara is very aware of that herself, that no matter how far she climbs and how much money she's able to save, that she's always going to have to navigate. It's like she's dragging that stigma behind her always.
And the precariousness as well. She doesn't have a huge wealthy family network to fall back on, which people at the top. I mean, obviously, this is a teeny percentage. Most Roman people, free or enslaved, live financially precarious lives. I think what it is that, courtesans were mixing at the very, very top, but they weren't the very, very top, if that makes sense. So they're people who are moving in that world, but they're not fully of that world. And, you know, there's sort of multiple ways of looking at it. So Terence writes about courtesans in his plays quite revealingly, you know, about how they seem so powerful and glamorous and beautiful, but actually they might, you know, when you see them eating when they're on their own, they'll be stuffing down the food, because actually they might be really hungry and not got much money. And one of his courtesans that Amara identifies with when she sees the play is kind of saying, you know, you have such a short window of time to make your fortune. You have to do everything you can to make money. So it's, yeah, the ones who are the most successful, and really from Roman standards, Demetrius is an extraordinarily generous patron. And I think if Amara had never met Philos, you know, she would have stuck to him like a limpet, and not had any kind of any doubts, or not have been torn in any way, because he is offering for the times an extraordinarily good deal. You know, he treats her kindly enough, and he financially takes care of her. And he's also an interesting man. I mean, I did really like Demetrius. He's quite a cold fish in lots of ways. I might call him an emotionally unavailable man if we were talking in today's
Yeah,
jargon.
I think that suits,
Yeah.
indeed, yes.
But I liked him, and I wanted to make him someone who was fully aware of, you know, many different levels of his own identity. So the fact that he decorates his extraordinarily expensive villa with scenes from Aesop's fables, which is a very homely and kind of slave orientated set of stories. You know, fables were associated with enslaved people. Those are the stories that they would tell. And so it's kind of like he's owning that aspect of his identity. He's getting in there first before anyone could mock him. I guess the opposite of like a Trimalchio and the Satyricon, who's kind of overdoing it with his money to try and overcome the stigma of having been enslaved. You know, we know that Demetrius's house outside of Rome is even more ostentatious, but in Rome he's careful not to overstep, you know, his status.
Right. And another interesting male character that we get throughout the series is Pliny the Elder. He
Oh, I
is
love
such a
Pliny.
key
He's
figure.
terrible, but
Oh,
I
I
love
love
him.
Pliny. I know. Well, let's talk a little bit about that he's terrible, but we love him, because I agree. Yes. He is such a key figure in Amara's life. He is
Mm.
responsible for freeing her. She feels a huge amount of loyalty and love for him because of everything he's done, but also, you know, as you say, he has his limitations when it comes to being a patron and what he's willing to do or not do for Amara and the way he views her. So I just feel like Pliny
Mm.
is, I mean, I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about Pliny, because he is a real life figure. He features in all of the
Yeah.
books. I'm curious to know why you decided to include him, but also was hoping you talk a little bit about what you think he tells us about, especially a male Roman citizen's attitudes about slaves and people who were once slaves, and especially women.
So I think Pliny is quite an unusual Roman. He, you know, by all accounts of his nephew, he was a pretty eccentric man. Just the sheer facts of his life point to a certain eccentricity. His authorial voice is quite eccentric in the natural history. It's one of the reasons I was so drawn to the character. So I guess, you know, on the kind of plus points of Pliny, he is this man of an insatiable curiosity about people, things, places, nature. I mean, there is nothing in the world that does not interest him. So that includes women, that includes enslaved people. You know, he is on a superficial level interested in everyone and everything. But his interest still comes with its limitations, because he, you know, particularly in the first book, he's fond of Amara and he finds her really interesting, but he's absolutely incapable of empathizing with her. He just can't. Um, so he's not a bad man like in inverted commas, like some of the other characters. He wishes her no ill, but he can't really comprehend her suffering, or nor does he feel responsible for it. And yes, he does come good for Amara, but it's almost accidental. It's certainly not his main intention. He does it to solve an issue for another man as much as he does it for Amara. So they have this strange relationship where, because the books are written from Amara's point of view, we see Pliny through Amara's eyes, and she absolutely idolizes him. She adores him. But for me, as the writer, I don't idolize him. And I think he's profoundly flawed, both in how he deals with Amara, the way that he expects service from her, reading. It's kind of endearing, and as services go, expecting her to read for hours and hours. It's not like he's expecting sexual services or for her to scrub his floor, but it's still an act of service. She's not ever there at his parties fully as a guest in her own right. She is a freed woman who owes a certain amount of entertaining or service to the free people. So there's that aspect which makes him very much of his time. But in terms of creating the character, so he's a key character in all three books. We actually don't have masses of material on sort of Pliny's personal life, who he was as an individual. What we do have is very vivid, but it's still not masses. And, what we do have is his nephew, Pliny the Younger's account of the eruption. And obviously I cover all of Pliny the Elder's involvement in the rescue mission in book 3. But I took aspects of his character that are revealed in that time in his life and then translated them into the first book. So, on the plus side, he's someone who was immensely brave, who demonstrated this extraordinary curiosity about the natural world, even when it was at great personal risk, who also, had a deep sense of moral responsibility to launch a humanitarian effort. So these are all the positives about him. On the negative side, he's just deeply eccentric, how he responds to the disaster as well, insisting on behaving normally, having a bath, making everyone have dinner. He's snoring his way through some of the eruption. He's quite an oblivious man. He's very hyper focused. He's got his special interests, shall we say?
Yes, very self-absorbed for sure.
Deeply self-absorbed, but not talking about himself. He's self-absorbed in his obsessions. So he's an obsessive personality, and this is very much based on what we know of him. So his nephew wrote of him, that he never stopped either reading or being read to or taking notes or obsessing over his writing. And my God, he was, an incredibly busy statesman and in the army, and he wrote a phenomenal amount of books. So he was every second of the day engaged in working. He was an absolute workaholic. And his nephew says that, the only time he took a pause was for his bath. And he says, and by his bath, I mean the actual immersion. So, you kind of got this image of Pliny, people reading to him at the side of the bath, as the only time they stop is when he's underwater. I mean, it's just, yeah.
Oh, yes. He's a really interesting character to see brought to life in fiction, because he is, as you say, he's very eccentric and just an interesting man. And yes, Amara certainly sees him through rose-colored glasses.
Yeah. And he's, of all the men she comes across, in many ways, he is, although he doesn't see her fully as a person, he doesn't sexualize her. What he wants from her is different from what other men want from her. I think that's quite a key issue. He's not just wanting more of the same of what's always been demanded of her. So, reading to him and talking to him about the things that he's interested in is, it's implying more about his sense of her worth as well. What he values her for, what she's useful to him for is more aligned to who she is as a person.
Yes, and I think being seen as, at least in some ways, being seen as an intellectual it's important to Amara to be able to meet with someone intellectually and talk to him about matters of the mind, rather than, as you say, most of the men throughout the series sexualize her and want
And
want her
singer.
body as much as anything else. Yeah. So
Yeah, I mean, he is flawed as well. So yeah, but I have to say, I ended up loving him.
yeah, I loved him. And I think both he and Demetrius show us in many ways the best of Roman society in terms of how one might treat someone who had been enslaved, someone who is in service to them. I mean, they're both men who, treat Amara well in some ways, and in other ways it's still a fraught relationship, but it
Yeah,
was interesting.
she's not an equal.
You're right.
Yeah,
Right.
she's not an equal, but they are benign, benign patrons as opposed to, very manipulative, oppressive, or cruel ones.
Let's take a quick break to hear about another excellent book you'll definitely want to add to your shelves.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rad.
And I'm Dr. G.
And together we are the Partial Historians. We host an ancient Roman history podcast.
And we're really thrilled to announce that we've also just published our first book together.
That's right, if you want to hear all about the Roman monarchy, the very first era of Rome, this is the place to look. Dr. G, do you enjoy taking strolls through the wood with a goddess?
I certainly do. Do you enjoy running over your relatives when you decide to finally take power for yourself?
You know it. If you enjoy these sorts of stories, then you're going to love the Roman kings and the regal period. So make sure you pick up a copy of our book, Rex, the Seven Kings of Rome.
Rex, the Seven Kings of Rome, can be found online as an ebook through our Gumroad store, The Partial Historians. It can also be found on Amazon Kindle. And if you're interested in a very physical copy of the book and you happen to be based in Australia, it is also available in Abbey's bookstore in Sydney. Visit partialhistorians.com and you can find all the details about how to purchase the book there.
And now it's back to the Exploress.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Britannica. We have to talk about Britannica. Definitely just such an amazing character. So I think it was about at the end of book 2 that we see her training to become a gladiator, a female gladiator. And then in book 3, we actually get to see her being a gladiator and we get to see her fight, which was deeply, deeply satisfying, I have to say. So can you tell us a little bit about
My favorite
oh
song.
gosh, it was so satisfying. I loved it. And I loved being able to see a female gladiator because we do know, or we have some hints that there were some female gladiators in ancient Rome. So
There
can you
definitely were female
right.
gladiators.
So can you
yeah.
tell us a little bit more
Mm.
about that, the kind of research you did and what you found about specifically about gladiator culture, but female gladiators?
So I think, I have to say, I romanticized Britannica's life as a gladiator. It would have been, she's very lucky to have Stephanus, a Lannister, who adores her and supports her so much. There's no question I have romanticized the life of a gladiator in the series. Ultimately, it's fiction. So I should make that little disclaimer because the relationship that the highly respectful relationship that Britannica has with her Lannister Stephanus is, potentially not the relationship all gladiators would have. But what we know about female gladiators, they were nothing like as common as male gladiators. They were an anomaly. They were often a novelty act. So Domitian, for instance, would have women fight against people with dwarfism. They would sometimes be fights at times like the Floralia, scantily dressed. So there was that kind of slightly titillating novelty aspect. There was also more serious fighting that went on. So in Ostia, there are records of, women putting each other to the sword in gladiator fights, which is not a novelty. They were really fighting. We've also got in modern day Turkey a Roman relief showing 2 women gladiators fighting, and again, it's not presented as a novelty at all. They've got the sort of stage names Aquileia and Amazonia, and it's recording an actual fight between two actual gladiators, so far as we know. In terms of the type of style of fighting that I had Britannica take on, so she's a net man, which was a slightly feminized role anyway for gladiators, because they were in like a padded tunic and they had like a long trident, so it wasn't seen as such a manly role. So it would be a more likely role for a woman to take on anyway, because it was already seen as quite effeminate. And yeah, I mean, as I say, I have romanticized Britannica's life as a gladiator to a degree, but they were it was a really strange life of these close-knit communities. Many, as I reflect in the book, are ex-convicts or they were enslaved. Some people did choose to become gladiators because there was the fame as well. If you did well, the fame, the adulation, after a certain number of fights, you might, like Stephanus, the Lannister in the book, you could get your freedom. And there were also laws preventing highborn people and even highborn women from becoming gladiators. And the fact that these laws even existed suggests that some people might have had a go. So I guess always, it was a very dangerous job. The conditions could be quite harsh. I mean, it kind of depended where you were a gladiator, but, you might be treated as more or less enslaved. You might have greater freedom. But yeah, it was this very strange life of intense danger, but also glamour and adulation. And although it was incredibly dangerous, it was expensive to kill gladiators. So it wasn't like they were just slaughtering people willy-nilly. They had convicts. I mean, the Romans were awful. I mean, the whole idea of watching people killing each other for laughs is just disgusting, to be honest. But they had beast hunts and stuff like that, in which convicted prisoners whose lives were absolutely cheap and had to die anyway would be slaughtered. So the gladiators themselves, although they were fighting in the arena of death, they were the least expendable of the human fighters. So yeah. And for Britannica, who comes from, a culture where she was a fighter and that was part of her identity in spite of being a woman, this is as close as she gets to, some sense of her own identity. I think she embraces what it means to be a gladiator.
Mm. And I think one of the things that makes this scene in which we see her fight so satisfying is that Britannica, from the moment we meet her, has a lot of rage. She's been, taken, she's been enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
She's a warrior who's been enslaved and taken away from her home and her family and her culture and put into this. I mean, she just fights it every step of the way and she's very angry. So it's just wonderful to get to see her. I mean, it's brutal, but it's also kind of amazing to be able to see her fighting back.
Yeah, it's an expression of her rage and her sense of herself and her pride, because in The Wolf Den, Britannica is in many ways the most harrowing character because she does fight back. And so there's no veneer of consent as to what goes on in the brothel where Britannica's concerned. This is, it's just anguish and rage and humiliation and all the rest. And she does constantly fight back at huge sort of cost to her psyche, really. And so Britannica is in some ways the least realistic character in the books. And she's also, I think, not coincidentally, probably the most popular. She's the one people write to me and say, I love Britannica, because she's who we'd all like to be. And that's what Amara feels when she sees her fighting. It's extremely rare that people have the courage to be quite that resistant to oppression. It's unusual. It doesn't happen often that people do that. So Britannica is the most unusual character in the books. And also, when I wrote that scene, and it was a scene that I had wanted to write for a very long time, it's probably one of my favorite scenes in the whole trilogy. The Temple of Fortuna is the most dramatic out of the three books, and it's got the most kind of set pieces, I would say. But, women fighters were seen as novelties, but I wanted to see that fight from the point of view, Amara's sitting with the women, men and women sat differently in in the arena. They sat in different places. The women were at the upper levels. And really, for men, seeing a woman fighting with a sword might have some sort of titillating or sexual content. But for the women to see a woman like that asserting her power, I thought that might have had a different impact. They might have felt differently about it. I mean, sure, some might have thought, oh, wow, shameful woman. But maybe others got a vicarious sense of agency in watching it.
Yeah, you can only imagine that must have been true. And I think that's what makes, I mean, this series is really powerful for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that you imagine the ancient world through the eyes of women, and especially women who have been exploited, women who have been enslaved, women, it's a perspective we don't see a lot either in actual, extant sort of historical sources that we have, and we don't see it a lot in fiction. So it is satisfying and interesting to be able to, what might it have been like for women to be watching a woman in the arena?
Yeah, because the perspectives that we're given on the ancient world are so kind of relentlessly male and generally, elite. So it is life seen through one very specific perspective, and there were other perspectives, and we get sort of fragments of them in graffiti, or the odd letter, or in some literature, you get these kind of snippets, and you can often read between the lines and imagine what it might have felt like from the other side. But I think, one of the balancing acts in writing ancient world fiction from the point of view of characters whose perspectives we don't have so much of is that you want to be true to that world, to the sort of psychological constraints that they would have faced. So they wouldn't have had feminism. They wouldn't have had, notions of emancipation as a individual emancipation. Yes, you yourself personally don't wish to be enslaved. A wider sense that there should be no slavery, that is not something that was a school of thought in the ancient world. They didn't have access to that type of kind of world smashing ideology. That it wasn't there. But at the same time, we know that people resisted in individual ways, and they wanted more for themselves. And so I guess the starting point is, okay, we have this quite rigid psychological plane in which characters have to inhabit, because that is what they would have inhabited at the time. But within that, we know also from human nature, everyone's the hero of their own story. You unavoidably only have your own perspective on life. And, the Romans were aware of this kind of undercurrent perspective that they were slightly fearful of. The elite Romans, I mean, this the saying that you have as many enemies as you have slaves. They were aware that people didn't enjoy this. And some of the writing about women, Juvenal's anxiety about women trying to seize power. And when you look at kind of elite women who did take power and did wield power, the deep unease over this, because ultimately all human beings, men, women, freed, enslaved, they have the same basic desires for love, respect, freedom, over their own lives. This remains constant.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about, we said that there would be no spoilers, but I think it's safe to say that in this book, we do get to see the eruption of Vesuvius, which is, as you say, like incredibly dramatic because, of course, and we get to see Amara go through this incredibly harrowing experience. And it just reads as like the scenes in which we see the eruption and the aftermath are so visceral, and they're so, like, I just couldn't put the book down. I could not. I stayed up very late because I could not put it down. And I'm curious to know what sorts of research you did to be able to bring that disaster to life on the page.
So I got quite hung up initially about writing the volcano. So my primary source was Pliny the Younger's letters, because that's one of the only contemporary sources we have. And then which is extraordinary as well. It's a lot of detail in a very, very human way. I think that's what's so astonishing about Pliny the Younger's account is, he's not a volcanologist. He's not able to tell us about the, why volcanoes erupt or any of that stuff, or what the, the exact time frame. But what he describes is what it felt like to be caught up in the middle of it. All the small details, like the fact that people put pillows on their heads to protect themselves from debris, or they, even though it was the middle of the day, it was so dark, they had to take lamps out to see where they were going. So that was my main source. I then did, obviously read about volcanoes, and in particular about Vesuvius, and the sort of time span, and the fact that, the archaeological evidence suggests that there were earthquakes at the same time. But ultimately, I came to a point where I just had to stop, because Amara would not have known any of these things, and what I wanted to capture in this book was not like the definitive volcano book. This is exactly what happened when Vesuvius erupted. This was the time frame. This was the type of pyroclastic flow. What I was trying to capture is what it might have felt to have been caught up in it. The absolute confusion, the not knowing what was happening, the fact that everything is very disjointed and bewildering and dark, and smothering. And the exhaustion. So that was really, in the end, my approach to the eruption of Vesuvius, as to see it almost as, when you tell a well-known event of history, it can become too familiar and you can have too much knowledge. And so I almost wanted to approach it, certainly in terms of the writing, as from the point of view of someone who had absolutely no understanding of what was going on. It was really important to me that, the volcano happens about halfway to 2/3 of the way through the book. And I wanted to look at the aftermath, because I don't think this is written about, certainly in fiction, anything like as much. And it was, it is fascinating for what it tells us about the Romans. There was this massive relief effort. The emperor was involved. It was a huge humanitarian crisis, and how people rebuilt their lives, where they rebuilt them, how they coped. This was something that I really wanted to look at in detail as well.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting because, as you say, it's really not anything I've read about, like what actually happened to all of these people who escaped after Vesuvius. What kinds of lives did they build, and what did the rest of the Roman Empire do to try to relieve those survivors? It was really, really interesting to read about that.
Thank you. I mean,
and I don't, we can't talk too much about it. There are many things I want to say about what happens at the end of the book, but I can't. So.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, we're not talking about specific characters, we have gaps in our knowledge of how that relief effort worked, but, we've got enough to know that it was massive, that, it came from the very top. Titus himself visited the relief effort, which, in terms of non-fiction writers, it has been compared to the way that presidents, visited disasters. It's morale boosting as much as being able to do something specific yourself as an emperor or as a president. And also to show the officials who are dealing with it, look, this is important to me. I'm keeping an eye on what you're doing. Don't stuff it up. So that's how I perceived of the emperor's involvement. And, other aspects. So we know from, Roman historians that there was a lot of money went into it, that, former consuls were appointed to oversee the rebuilding, that people who died without heir in the eruption, the state didn't take their money, that went back into the rebuilding effort. So there was a lot going on. There's stuff that we don't know the specifics of that I kind of guessed. So just like Pliny sends out the fleet on a rescue mission, I imagine the fleet being involved in the rebuilding. I imagine the Roman army being involved, putting up refugee camps, because, the Roman military encampment was a very famous thing. It worked well for the army. Presumably they would have had to have done that. We know that lots of people, increasingly archaeological evidence suggests that a lot of people survived. They didn't all die. The people of Pompeii and Herculaneum, many did survive. Naples had a whole district named after Herculaneum for hundreds of years, which suggests that, a large concentration of the population went there. And then there are also kind of epigraphs that suggest Pompeian families also stayed in the area that they escaped.
Yes, to give us a glimpse of what rebuilding your life after that disaster would look like. It does make for an incredibly dramatic, last third of the book and ending to the series. Elodie, it's just such an incredible series. I devoured it. I'm going to read it again. I'm
Oh,
going to
thank you,
keep
Kate.
handing it to anyone who loves. Oh yeah, I love it. I really love it. I think it's such an engrossing, hugely satisfying series, and I'm just so grateful that there are very talented authors like you who are giving voice to women specifically from history in the ancient world and giving us a chance to get a glimpse into what their lives might have been like. So on that note, I have an idea what you might be working on next, but can you tell us what's next for you? What are you writing?
So my next book is called Boudica's Daughter. And so it's set, in the decades before the Wolf Den starts. So, that starts in the mid-70s AD, and obviously this will start in the early 60s AD. And there is one character from the books who has a cameo, and that's Britannica. But she would have been a child then. So, before people who like Britannica get too excited, she is only a child in this time period. So she obviously isn't going to be the lead. But I guess that's how the worlds are interconnected. But yeah, so Boudica's daughter, the main character, is one of her two daughters. And so a bit like the Temple of Fortuna not being a volcano eruption, a volcano book in the sense of that's the culmination of it. The rebellion is not the culmination of this book. It happens relatively early on. So it deals a lot with the aftermath and not just staying in Rome and Britain, because although Boudica's a real historical figure, as are her daughters, as is Paulides, Boudica's kind of nemesis, the Roman general that she fought, we know nothing really about what happened to the daughters afterwards. So it's I guess a bit like Pliny. It's real characters about whom we know a certain amount, but not so much that you can't do a lot of creating yourself. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I'm enjoying researching that and planning that in a minute.
Oh, good. Well, I'm looking forward to it too. I mean, we've covered Boudica on the Exploress, and I just feel like the ancient world provides such incredible fodder. It's like we get these glimpses of women, but there's so many gaps and so much we don't know. And, it's just.
And they're so filtered through, all this stuff that's been constructed. You look at Tacitus's picture of Boudica as like this noble, savage leader, and then the warrior queen, and then you look at Cassius Dio, who sees her as a kind of genocidal maniac. So which was she both? It's
Well, I will wait on that one with bated breath. But I will say in the meantime that this trilogy is incredible. And I hope, listeners, that you all run out and get the Temple of Fortuna. If you haven't read the other two, it's, the series is complete. So now you can binge the whole thing. And I fully encourage you to do that. So thank you so much, Elodie, for coming back on the show and talking about women of the ancient world with me.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The Temple of Fortuna is out now, so go and grab yourself a full set. If you like the Exploress, tell a friend about it, leave a review wherever you listen, become a patron, or shoot me an email telling me what you love about it. You can find show notes for this episode at my website, and you can also find me on Instagram at the Exploress Podcast.